the Financial Times, Quentin has been at the centre of history in the making for several decades. The title of his talk is The Challenge for the UK.
I'm very sorry, I can't hear that this is a very echoey place. I don't know how.
Sorry, could we improve on the microphone?
Well, the microphone is appear to be on. That's it.
It is on.
It is on.
It is on. Can anyone else not hear? Okay. There is a T loop for hearing aids if you use a hearing aid. But I was assured that this was a very modern microphone and very effective. Okay. The title of Quentin's talk is The Challenge for the UK and Europe in a Dystopian World. We look forward to your talk, Quentin, and trust that it will make us better informed, but not too depressed, as senior citizens in a very troubled world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. And how's the sound with my voice now? Is it okay? I have a sort of, it's like they tend to say, you've got a good face for radio. I've got actually quite a good voice for radio. So I hope it works. I'm a bit daunted by this, one, by being your first speaker in such a wonderful venue, it leaves me feeling great respect for all those vicars who have to preach in a church this size, because it's quite daunting when you actually have the size of the room looking at you like this. I'm also a bit daunted by my rather rash choice of both title and subject, because I suddenly realised, before this, I thought, well, this will be easy, this is what we think about all the time. I suddenly realised that we're living in the middle of such a frantic news agenda and such a constant changing scene on the news channels that actually I kept ripping up what I was going to say and beginning again and so on. So my apologies if I'm not as carefully structured in what I say as I would like to be. I mean, this week alone, what have we had? We had 3 quite important European elections last Sunday. We had the EU-UK reset of relations on Monday. We had Trump talking for 2 hours to Vladimir Putin on Monday. We had Gaza starving and then aid resuming and Israel condemned. And we had Trump gallivanting around the Middle East on his agenda, managing to go nowhere near the one place which really mattered in the Middle East, which was Israel. So a strange but constantly moving news agenda. As a journalist all my working life, I'm used to trying to make order out of chaos. That was my job. It was to sort of make the world intelligible to people. And working for the Financial Times, make the world intelligible to people who wanted to either spend money or not lose their money. I always used to say I was talking to people either to fear or to greed, and it was a very good discipline. However, the problem today is that we face a world with Donald Trump in power in Washington that is both chaotic and, if I may say so, unpredictable. And I think it makes it rather foolish to try and forecast what is going to happen, because every day something seems to be new. He announces dramatic tariffs on one day, and a week later he's paused them, or even cut them in half. You never quite know. The other thing I worry a little bit about is that I rather suspect, talking to an Islington audience, that you're all pretty much as obsessed by what's happening on the world stage as I am. I can't stop. I keep wanting to turn the news off, and I can't do it. It's a professional failing. So I'm a bit worried that I'm actually going to be able to say anything to you that you don't already know all too well. So perhaps it's just going to be the order in which I put things, which will hopefully make you sit up. in this modern world, I suspect there was a temptation for me to say, I think I'll get AI to write my speech. Fortunately, I'm completely incapable of using AI. But secondly, I've always felt, and I worry about this, that actually more and more AI is being used in journalism, in writing, and so on. When I was a journalist, which I was full-time until 10 years ago, and still part-time today, I think the best stories were the stories that surprised people, that made people sit up and say, I didn't realise that, or I didn't realise that that and that related to each other. Whereas if everything's written by AI, with algorithms that are already dictated to it, to the instrument or whatever it is, it's not going to surprise people, it's going to tell them what it's been told to tell them. And that worries me. So I assure you that I haven't used AI at all for what I'm about to tell you, which may make it less coherent, but I hope makes it a little more original. And finally, forgive me for being rather disorganized, but I hope that the stream of consciousness that I give to you now will provoke a good discussion and some good thoughts, and don't hesitate to tell me if you think I'm talking rubbish. Let me start like this. I think I should start by saying, what do I mean by inventing a word, dystrumpian, this dystrumpian world? A world, I think, that is both disordered and dysfunctional. It's a very uncomfortable place where our old certainties are being called into question, where indeed everything that we've been used to for most of our lives, for all of our lives. I was born in 1948. I'm a child of 1948. And when you think that post-war world has been completely dominated by the post-war multilateral order, the United Nations, and all the international associations that were built up to try and ensure that the ghastly world of the Second World War, and indeed the First World War, would never happen again. All those old certainties are being called into question. But let me go a little further into dystrumpian and dystrumpianism. Let's ask a little bit, who is Donald Trump? What do we need to know about him that matters? Because he is an extraordinary figure, and for anybody who thinks that it's not personalities of people that make history, I think Donald Trump, and we may not like him, but I think Donald Trump proves that personalities really do matter. Okay, what do we know about him? We know, because he keeps telling us, that he's a businessman, he's a deal maker. Not actually a very successful one, I would say. Perhaps he wouldn't, because how many times did he go bankrupt? I think at least 4. But that's what drives him. He is, as everybody says, transactional. He never works to an agenda. I was talking to somebody who attended several meetings with him in his first presidency and says he literally won't follow an agenda. Not only that, he never reads his briefs. That, I believe, he shares with somebody rather closer to home, our good friend Boris Johnson. He never read his briefs either. But there is a key difference, I think, between them. Donald Trump is really overwhelmingly ignorant of history. He's not interested in history. He's interested in business. Boris Johnson did, I think, know about history, but perhaps he didn't always pay as much attention to it as he should have done. Trump is erratic, idiosyncratic, volatile, capricious, and self-obsessed. He is not a very attractive character, although I am assured by people who've been in the room with him that he can be quite charming. He can also, as we've seen publicly all too often, be rude and aggressive and angry and resentful. He detests, and this is where we get pretty relevant to my theme of today, he detests multilateralism. In effect, what I said, the whole world order since the Second World War. He thinks the US has been ripped off by the system that it helped to create. He thinks that the US has been ripped off in a series of bad trade deals and has been given up far too much of its own natural power towards a shared power through the international institutions. Now, the problem for Europe is that the European Union, remember the European Union? We used to be a member of it once. The European Union has, as Ursula von der Leyen likes to say, it has multilateralism in its DNA. It's symbol of multilateralism. It lives multilateralism. Its whole way of working is about cooperation and compromise. It is actually invented to ensure that the big powers do not dominate the small powers in Europe. The European Union is a wonderful invention for small countries, and that's why they love it most. And the big countries like Britain, like France, Britain fell out of love with it, and France also seems to resent it, even though outsiders say, but of course they run the show. Well, actually, they don't. It's very multilateral. It's exactly the world and the sort of organisation that a MAGA American, a Make America Great Again American, doesn't like at all, instinctively as opposed to it. Let me tell you one other thing about Donald Trump. This is, like many of us, he is a child of the 1950s. He remembers an America which was the dominant manufacturing power in the world. It ruled the world not only with its military power at the end of the Second World War, but with its economic and manufacturing power. That's the world he would like to restore again. He doesn't really understand, in a curious way, the world of economic services. The fact that America has a great trade surplus in its economic services, even though it has a huge trade deficit in manufacturing. So he wants to turn the clock back. He is, to that extent, a revanchist. He sees trade deficits in manufacturing trade as evidence that the US is being ripped off by its partners. He shares, if you like, with his nation, that sense of being oppressed. He's got a chip on his shoulder about it. But at the same time, that's why he loves tariffs. He says tariffs will bring back a new order. And yet the moment the markets demonstrate that they think introducing massive, ridiculous tariffs on no known logical basis is actually a very bad idea, he panics and gives it up. Hence the unpredictability. For a business investor, therefore, Donald Trump may on one level look like rather a good thing, somebody who's going to cut taxes, who's going to really promote business in America. But for a second thing, he is a disaster because he's so unpredictable. He changes his mind. He pauses the tariffs. So he already is seeing a real backlash against the original polling that he had when he was elected. He also thinks rules are for suckers. This is a man who basically seems to disregard the rule of law, but here comes the first contradiction. This is a man who uses the courts constantly. I believe somebody did a calculation of how many times Donald Trump went to court to sue somebody, to ask lawyers to solve a problem in his first term in office, 3,500 times. And yet this is a man who seems to regard the rule of law as irrelevant, as something that you really do not have to observe. He's strategically incoherent too, demanding, for example, that Europe and the European countries should pay dramatically more for their own security and defence. A demand which, I must say straight away, I think he's quite justified in making. But immediately, while he's demanding that the European countries pay much more, he then imposes massive tariffs on their trade, which is going to make their economies function much worse. So the logic there really escapes me. And just as he hates multilateralism, he's fascinated by power and powerful people. So he seems to be curiously but fundamentally attracted by somebody like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, not to mention the sheikhs and princes of the Middle East. And he seems to despise his allies because they're weak. So somebody like Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House, we all saw, was treated with utter disdain and continues to be constantly criticised, even though he was never the aggressor in the war that he's fighting. Or take that ultimately, that most attractive and unaggressive country in the world that we all love, Canada. How on earth does he think that bullying Canada is actually going to make friends in the wider world, or bullying all his allies when actually he wants allies against those who he feels are genuine rivals like China? He dislikes liberals or anybody who smacks of liberalism. Remember his relationship with Angela Merkel. Remember his relationship with Justin Trudeau. I suspect, too, that he actually really doesn't respect very much, in spite of the fact that he pretends he does, our own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, because he's much too reasonable, and also he's a man of the law. So all told, Donald Trump behaves very much like a mafia don. They're talking constantly about respect and the need for respect. A little while ago, the New York Times wrote a column which questioned who was playing who. Was Putin really playing Donald Trump and was in control of the relationship? Or were they really like a pair of mafia dogs, just negotiating over who had which territory? And a friend of mine said, which do you think? And I said, I've no doubt they are like a pair of mafia dogs, but I think there's a crucial difference between them. Vladimir Putin is a mafia don who is also a killer. He learned his trade on the back streets of St. Petersburg, Leningrad as it was. And he was a real rough boy from the back streets of St. Petersburg. Donald Trump was a rent collector. He went round bullying tenants to get the rents for his father's properties. So they're quite different sorts of mafiosi, even though I think they both have this huge consciousness about their respect and their position. So they do understand each other to that extent. One is a killer, and the other is just a bully. Because I think that for all his faults, I don't think Donald Trump is a killer. In fact, he's quite prepared to tolerate others doing the killing. He seems to not actually be too appalled by the fact that Vladimir Putin does not stop bombing civilians in Ukraine, or indeed that Israel has kills so many civilians in its pursuit of Hamas in Gaza. And yet Donald Trump talks constantly about peace, and actually pointless wars. He keeps calling Ukraine a war that should never have happened. And that, I think, is more about his own self-esteem, that he is still desperate to win a Nobel Peace Prize, just like Barack Obama did before him, and he cannot understand why that should have happened if he's not going to get one too. He's therefore full of contradictions and very difficult to deal with. It's partly tactical. He's quite deliberate in raising confusion and raising contradictions. I was told a story the other day about the first time he met Theresa May. If you remember, she was the first foreign leader to go to Washington to visit him when he was elected for his first term. And it was at that moment when she was about to start negotiations on Brexit, negotiations with Brussels. And apparently what happened was Donald Trump said straight away, well, I tell you what my advice is, sue the European Union. And apparently Theresa May said, well, why should I? What have they done wrong? And he said, no, you just sue them. It'll put them on the back foot and they won't know how to react. That's your first step. And it was absolutely classic Donald Trump. It'll destabilize them. So let me just ask this. What's he done that really matters to us here in Britain and in Europe, and how should we be trying to deal with it? Well, one, his withdrawal from so many international agreements and international organizations, his withdrawal from the climate change agreement, his withdrawal from the World Health Organization, and most dramatically recently, his decimating of the budget of USAID and US development aid, which I'm sure you're all aware has had dramatic effects almost instantly around the world. We had a friend who came to visit us the other day from Pakistan, who is a public health service doctor in Pakistan, responsible for their vaccination program. He said they had to lay off almost immediately 3,000 people responsible for the vaccination program in Pakistan. And in a country like Kenya too, dramatic layoffs from these cuts in US international engagement, undermining in an extraordinary way what was the most positive power of America in the world, its soft power. Its ability to influence people and do good by spending money in conflict zones, in international disasters and so on. The tragedy of those cuts is enormous, and the whole process is undermining the United Nations and its agencies, those agencies that have in fact helped resolve the conflicts of the world and deal with the crises of the world ever since 1945. Second thing that he's done that is dramatic is his tariff wars. Threatening global tariff wars, and therefore, as almost every economist worthy of the name said instantly, threatening a global recession. Now it may be that he won't do it in the end. Do we know? Maybe April the 2nd, so-called Liberation Day in America, will turn out to have been peak Trump, and that the pause for 90 days that he suddenly announced, first for everybody in the world except China, and then for China, maybe that will be the end of it. I don't think it will, because the damage has been done. Bad deals are already being done to try and unscramble the initial action. Bad deals, I fear, like the one that we have very proudly trumpeted, the US-UK so-called trade deal, which, as was described by my former colleague Alan Beattie, writing about trade in the Financial Times, as a bit like paying protection money to a mob boss, that actually we've done a very special deal that rides roughshod over the principle of most favoured nation treatment in the international trade agreement of the World Trade Organization, but claim that this is actually a very good deal because it saved Jaguar Land Rover and the British steel industry from tariffs that should never have been imposed in the first place. So tariffs may come, may stay, but the damage is done. Thirdly, siding with Russia very clearly over Ukraine. We saw it in the White House. We saw that extraordinary way of treating Vladimir Zelensky in the White House, which we've just seen again yesterday with the way that he treated President Ramaphosa of South Africa in the White House, singling out somebody who he regards as weak to be hectored and basically insulted in the most public place in the world. Siding with Russia over Ukraine and threatening to abandon Article 5 of the NATO treaty. That's to say, I will not guarantee that an attack on one member state of NATO will be retreated as an attack on us all. If you haven't paid your dues, I'm not going to support you. Again, I don't defend the fact that Europe hasn't been paying its way in defence spending terms. But having said that, Article 5 is, if you like, the touchstone of the NATO treaty. The damage has been done by even questioning it, because it depends absolutely on trust in your allies. Then, the other key action, I think, that we should worry about came in straight away as soon as Donald Trump came to power, threatening his neighbour states with annexation, even invasion. He wouldn't rule out military intervention in Greenland. What on earth's the point? He's got enormous bases there already. The country is run by Denmark, which is an ally within NATO, but also threatening that Canada should be a 51st state of the United States, or threatening to take over Panama. Now, what is in common with all these things? A very important aspect of, I think, what is the underlying worldview of Donald Trump, which is that in his own backyard, he should be allowed to behave as he pleases. That's what he's got in common with Vladimir Putin. He understands the Russian idea that in their backyard they should be able to behave as they please. It's all part of Donald Trump's conception of the world as a world where the big powers will make the decisions and none of these tiresome international institutions where you have to make compromises. And then finally, I think, the other key aspect of the Trump regime in foreign policy terms is singling out China as the ultimate rival, the focus of his greatest tariff demands, and of his future power projection. If he runs down his forces in Europe, which is clearly threatening, the review will happen in the autumn of the numbers of US troops still in Europe, it is because he needs those forces in Asia and to confront China, not least in the South China Sea. So the question I want to ask, after sort of setting out the Donald Trump effect on the world, is he an aberration? Is this something new that may go away again in 4 years' time? And I fear the answer to that is no. Very clearly, no. He is extraordinary, he's different, he's unique even. He's a very weird person who is in charge of the greatest power in the world. But he's not an aberration. There is a continuity there that we must not ignore. If he'd been a one-term president, perhaps we were entitled to say he'll go away. One, he's been re-elected, and it could happen again. Two, we can see, for example, the sort of people he has gathered around himself, including his Vice President, J.D. Vance, to whom I will return, who seems to share quite a lot of his view of the world. But it's not just that he's not a one-term president any longer. His retreat into isolationism and the concept that a superpower must use that power to bully and to dominate, that has deep roots in American history. It goes back to the 1920s and the 1930s, the world of an isolationist America. The demands for burden sharing in NATO also go back a long way. And now just a little personal experience. When I was correspondent for the Financial Times in Germany, after I was in Moscow, I was in Russia during the Gorbachev years, and then I went to Germany in 1991. And I've been attending the Munich Security Conference. It used to be called the Wehrkunde, military science, for nearly 30 years on and off. It was an annual celebration of the Atlantic Alliance. It was a demonstration of Germany's fundamental commitment to NATO and to the whole concept of the Atlantic Alliance. It's also, I must say, a truly dreadful conference. It's in a hotel that is very smart and very comfortable and much too small for the occasion. And it is pestered by the most appalling numbers of security men following around in the wake of defense ministers and foreign ministers and prime ministers and so on. And you have to wear badges which very clearly identify whether you're allowed into that particular room or that particular room, and everybody's constantly checking up on you. It's the most horrendously sort of stratified conference you can imagine. The one thing I remember most vividly, though, is that every single year I attended, US senators and congressmen would come over and lecture the Europeans, especially the Germans, on their failure to pay their share of European defence costs. It was a constant theme right through the 1990s. So when Donald Trump goes on about burden sharing, he's very much on a theme which the Europeans ignored to their really discredit. They enjoyed very much, all of us, the peace dividend that came after the end of the Cold War. The size of the British Army, as I'm sure you all know, halved since 1991. The size of the German Bundeswehr as well. Actually, half the numbers. And as for, other equipment and so on, everything we managed to cut back. Every year, that American demand, politely put then, was politely ignored. But the tension was always there. And it really came to a head in those extraordinary years during George W. Bush's time as president and the Iraq War, when I was there sitting in the audience when there was an extraordinary confrontation between Donald Rumsfeld, the US Defense Secretary, and Joschka Fischer, the German Foreign Minister. And Rumsfeld came in and lectured the conference in a fairly aggressive way about not supporting America in Iraq. And Joschka Fischer tore up his speech, and he turned to the American Defense Secretary and said, "Mr. Secretary, I am not convinced. You taught us to be Democrats. I am an elected member of the German Bundestag, I'm a minister in the government. Our people do not believe in this war that you are planning to fight in Iraq. And I cannot persuade them otherwise. That is democracy." It was the most extraordinary emotional moment. And Donald Rumsfeld disappeared without actually really having a chance to, I'm sure he did have the chance, but he didn't answer the accusation. I am not convinced. The other thing that was clear at that time of the Bush regime was that already America was starting to shift its strategic vision, that Europe was no longer, because the Soviet Union was no longer in existence, Europe was no longer the absolute priority, that Asia and the Pacific and the Middle East were becoming much higher priorities. And that continued during the regime of Barack Obama, very clearly. So when now we get somebody like the new Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, in Brussels saying, "I'm sorry, but I've got to tell you that European security is not our first priority," that should come as no surprise. That's what's underlying this, if you like, terror regime of the man in the White House. There is a fundamental shift going on there. So it shouldn't have come as a shock when Hegseth gave that little lecture he did in Brussels. How are we doing on time? Good? Because I want to come to the one other real shock, which was a shock not just for Europe, but above all for Germany, the country in Europe that I probably know best, when J.D. Vance made his speech at that Munich conference, which was worse in a way than Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld was saying, "You're supposed to be our allies, why don't you support us?" J.D. Vance started to interfere in German politics. He lectured the German government about not giving platform space to the far-right Alternative für Deutschland. Why? This is not democracy, he said. You must give the far-right its way. He didn't call them the far-right. He praised them as the future of Germany. And it was a profound shock to all my friends in Germany who actually believe that they know from their history that you cannot give space to the growth of a far-right movement. And it went right deep into the German system, because the election that followed that meeting in Munich, only within a couple of weeks, and which Friedrich Merz, it showed dramatically how much has changed. Friedrich Merz I first met in the early 1990s as a young member of the European Parliament, and I was very impressed then. One, because he spoke beautiful English, which is always a great help. Not that I don't speak German, but it's always nice to be talked to in somebody who speaks my language better than his. And he was a passionate pro-European, but he was also a passionate Atlanticist. He brings those two things to office now as German Chancellor. But having said that, literally the night when he won the elections, he said, the first thing we've got to face up to is the fact that we can no longer be absolutely certain that America will be there as our security shield. We have got to rebuild our defences. And he went straight out, even before he'd managed to negotiate the new coalition, to the old parliament, where there was still a two-thirds majority that he could get together to change the German debt brake, the control on spending, so that defence spending was exempted from the rigid ceiling that they'd imposed up to that moment. And he's gone on with this theme very clearly. Now he's installed as Chancellor and he has his coalition in office, and you will have seen his words that he wishes the German army to be the most powerful army in Europe. Those are words that I suspect 30 years ago would have caused absolute horror in many audiences, not least in this country. And yet he's saying it now because he's saying we can no longer entirely trust America. And I'm absolutely adamant that we have to back Ukraine in its battle for sovereignty and independence with Russia. That is an enormous shift, I think, in the mentality of the centre-right in Germany. This is the Christian Democrat leader, who've always been passionate Atlanticists, and they are saying we can no longer trust the man in Washington. Now, the very first trips that he did, entirely predictable, I fear all German chancellors do this, but it was made much of at the time. The very first visit was to Paris, and the second visit, also very importantly, on the very same day, was to Warsaw. It was a difficult moment, because as you will have read and noticed, Friedrich Merz did not win endorsement in his first vote in the German Bundestag, which shows the relatively fragile nature of his coalition, with the AfD now the largest party in opposition, and him not being absolutely sure of his support within the grand coalition that is formed. But on the second vote, almost immediately, and he pushed it through, he did get his endorsement, and off he went to Paris to see Emmanuel Macron, where both men were adamant that they've got to get that Franco-German motor of the European Union working well again, because the security question for Europe is absolutely existential. And then third visit, and that's the country I want to come to for a moment, was to Warsaw, to Poland. And that will be, it's that three-way, that so-called Weimar Triangle of France, Germany and Poland, which I think now, with Britain absent, is going to be the key to European security. Nonetheless, in Poland, we saw it at the elections at the weekend. In Germany, we saw it at the German elections, and in France, we saw it at the French elections last year. There is a real threat of the rise of far-right, nationalist, anti-immigration parties. Parties that on the face of it would have a lot in common with Donald Trump in Washington. So the question is, can Europe get its act together, or is the far-right a real threat in terms of dividing Europe, for example, in its opposition to Russia in Ukraine? And the truth is that the elections we saw at the weekend are both reassuring and disturbing. At the weekend, there were elections, if you remember, in Romania for a new president, in Poland for a new president at just the first round, and in Portugal, little Portugal way down south, for a new government. And in each of them, the far right failed to get a majority, but didn't fail to show that it is a rising force. So in Romania, thank goodness, we've got a centrist new president now, who was the mayor of Bucharest. In Poland, the mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, managed to come top, but by a very small margin. And you could see from the other candidates who got the vote that there is probably a very narrow majority for nationalist far-right parties. And in Portugal, the centre-right came top, but didn't get an absolute majority. And the party that showed the biggest gain is the far-right party in Portugal. So in all of those cases, there is a real danger of parties with a sympathy for the policies of Donald Trump will continue to grow. But I would hasten to say that the far right is perhaps not quite as big a threat as the sort of headlines would have us believe, because they are almost by definition, parties of the far right, nationalist parties of the far right, they hate each other almost as much as they hate the other side. So in Poland, for example, and watch out for the second round of the elections, it's by no means guaranteed that the other right-wingers are all going to pile in behind the leading right-wing candidate and get him elected, because they can't stand him. And if you look at the European Parliament, all the parties of the far right are divided. They're in 3 different groups, and they can't stand each other. So Le Pen is in one group, but she won't work with Orbán. So each one is actually competing for a little bit of the same space. By definition, a nationalist party is not a very good European party. And so, from that point of view, we are not seeing a very coherent far-right movement in Europe. That certainly is no thanks to the likes of J.D. Vance or Elon Musk, who seem to think that the far-right is the right way forward for Europe. They must have 10 ears for European history. The only other question I would ask is this: is there a chance that Donald Trump will have the same effect on the far right in Europe that he had in the Canadian elections or in the Australian elections, where those who seem to be most identified with his views actually dramatically lost ground? The victory of Mark Carney in Canada is extraordinary, as it completely reversed the miserable state of the Liberal Party in the polls up to that moment. My only sorrow with the election of Mark Carney was that he got the leadership and my former colleague Chrystia Freeland, former deputy editor of the Financial Times, didn't get the candidacy, but that would have just been fun for me to enjoy. I actually appointed her Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times when I was foreign editor, and I was going to say, oh, well, you know, Canadian Prime Minister. Anyway, she didn't get it. Where does that all leave the UK? And let me wrap up in this way. In one way, the curious thing about Britain today is that in spite of Brexit, our politics look to be becoming more European, more continental European than they used to be. Just like Germany, just like France, the great centre-right and centre-left parties of the post-war period are losing ground very significantly, and our politics is fragmenting. Instead of having a two-party rule all the time, left to right and right to left, it looks like that we're going to have a political breakdown of at least 5 parties, and that doesn't include the nationalist parties as well. And the rise of Reform UK parallels the rise of populist right-wing parties in the rest of Europe. So ironically, our politics are becoming, if you like, more European rather than less. The other irony of our position is that one of the passionate convictions that I always heard from British government representatives, officials and politicians in Brussels was that one of the reasons that they were fundamentally suspicious of the European Union was that real security came from NATO, not from the European Union. That the European Union should never have a military wing, because that would compete with NATO. And the problem for Britain today, having left the European Union, is that it is NATO that is also apparently being undermined. got to reconsider, and we saw this in the EU-UK reset on Monday, what is it going to be its engagement with a defence union at the European Union level as opposed to NATO? And we want to be in it. We don't want to be left out. And we want our defence industries to have access to all that money that Brussels is suddenly putting aside for defence spending. 150 billion euros, which is not to be sneezed at. So that's the deal that actually was the most important thing that was done on Monday, was to open the door. They haven't finalised the details, but to open the door for that British engagement with an EU defence union. We're not there yet about the demise of NATO. It cannot be absolutely written off, but the undermining of Article 5 is fundamental. What nobody has yet seriously questioned in Washington, as far as I know, is the American nuclear deterrent. But on those grounds, nonetheless, we in Britain are much more exposed because we rely on American suppliers, Polaris, than the French, who always insisted that they would have an independent nuclear missile. Now, if America still maintains the nuclear umbrella, that is obviously a vital part of NATO. But there's no question but that the European Union and the European countries and European members of NATO, are going to have to up their defence spending dramatically in order to compensate for the winding down of US engagement. The deal, now that's immediately ahead of us. NATO summit, June the 16th to 18th, I think, about then, where Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, is proposing that Europe increases its defence spending to 3.5% of GDP instead of 2%, with an extra 1.5% for, if you like, broader, sort of vaguely defined defence spending, infrastructure spending, and so on. So actually, in total, 5%, that's what it's going to cost, 5% of GDP, to actually persuade Donald Trump that we're doing our bit. It's going to be a very difficult meeting, because just before it, there will be a G7 summit in that friendly place, Canada, which also should be attended by Donald Trump, where he might have really rather a difficult time on the tariff situation before he goes to the NATO summit. Donald Trump hates summits because he's not the centre of attention.